a reminder, the content here is for informational purposes only. Should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investors or potential investors in any a16z fund. For more details, please see a16z.com/disclosures.
So we have two awesome guests today. Super excited. Former colleagues Angela Strange and Anish Acharya. They're both general partners on the fintech team at a16z. Sharp thinkers, all around great humans. And they recently wrote a piece called "The Company of the Future is Default Global." So I want to jump right in. Angela and Anish, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I have a question for you. How do you feel about being outnumbered by Canadians right now?
I love Canadian. I've worked with a lot of great Canadians.
We'll make you a souvenir ID for next time, Rex.
Thank you. Default Global. So you wrote this piece. Unpack that a little bit for me. Tell me what it means to be default global and how that's different from the past.
Yeah, so default global is a concept I think that we've been batting around for a few years. Certainly when we were all together, we spoke about it, Rex. And Angela has been the first one that really explored this theme with a lot of the work she's done outside of the US. The idea in a nutshell is that, there's two ways to think about fintech. One is that it's payments, lending, insurance, banking, et cetera. And while that's certainly true, there's probably a broader view to be had of fintech, which is that it's a new business model for internet companies. And in a world where it is a new business model for internet companies, there's a lot of infrastructure and technology that needs to get built for those companies to be able to monetize in that way, because most financial services are so domestic, local, both in terms of preferences as well as regulations. And really, there's a whole stack of things you need to do on a per geo basis to be able to make money in that way in every country around the world.
Yeah, totally. It seems like a lot of the original companies were default local if you look at the success stories in the US. So I'm curious some of the things you think have changed that have moved towards being, quote, default global.
Yeah, so I think there's two major themes going on. One, to build on what Anish said, like I'm very fond of saying, every company is going to be a fintech company. What does that mean, right? Your business model that you knew of it used to be you'd use advertising, you would either charge consumers for the product, but now there's a third business model, which is very popular, which is financial services. And in addition to bringing in more money, it helps companies, better attract their customers, better retain them. Classic example, Lyft providing bank accounts for its drivers. But now if you're a company that is global, so take Service Titan, which is an operating system for plumbers, right? Like there's plumbers in the US, there's plumbers in the UK, there's plumbers in Australia. If you want to let them add text messaging, well, you can just partner with Twilio. Done. If you want to offer them bank accounts, now you're doing multiple different partnerships in multiple different countries, and it's just a very heavy lift. And so what are going to be the next banking infrastructure companies of the future? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And it's versions of just creating global infrastructure or potentially orchestrating between best-in-class infrastructure in different countries. So that's big theme number one that we can unpack a little bit. Big theme number two just relates to how companies grow, right? Like you think back 5 years ago, your company would start in, call it San Francisco because that's where we're based, but pick another major geo. You'd probably only hire people in that geo and in that location for X number of time, maybe years. And then you'd start to hire and do business around the world. Now, like you're investing at the seed, like after a lot of your companies are like, hey, we're 10 employees and we're located everywhere. So that's great. But then what's your software stack that you use for a 20, 50, 100 person company that's located everywhere? What's your payroll? What's your incorporation? What are your expenses? Like those companies are just starting to exist. And that's where the real opportunity as a new CEO or a new startup exists.
I think that's right. And I think that's an important point to expand on. COVID was a catalyst for many things. Borderless hiring is one of them. But I think that the mindset shift that teams went through as they started to hire globally, as well as start to operate globally, got them thinking about, why am I not selling globally? Because a Zoom call is a Zoom call with a customer, whether they're in the next town over or the next country over. And the COVID thing catalyzed a lot of the global work in an obvious way, but I think it also changed the mindset of a lot of founders to go global a lot sooner.
Yeah, totally. And I think and Angela brought this up, she mentioned Lyft. It's interesting to think about the companies that had to build financial services infrastructure. Maybe they started locally. They weren't even financial services company like Lyft. They expand internationally. And now they're like, oh, I have to do payouts all around the world. And now that means you have not just Lyft, but Service Titan, Uber, all of these other companies have had to figure out how to build some degree of international financial services infrastructure, which means there's now this class of operators who understand how to build these things and understand how hard it was. I think that's really the key insight for so much in the fintech space is people, operators figuring out like, oh my God, here are some of these huge problems that I have to solve. And now they have some of the skill sets to solve it.
Oh, I was going to say, Anish initially coined this, right? And the like what entrepreneurs in this space are fighting is like the huge demand from the default global companies, right? Like Service Titan. But when you think about financial services, like the pull is very much default local, right? Like every country has its own payment rails, its own regulation, even its own consumer preferences to pay. And so how do you solve those things? And there's just some really smart teams going about it in interesting ways.
Yeah. I guess if you think about like 6 years ago, there wasn't necessarily the talent that understood how to build global payouts among other financial kind of services layers internationally. And there also wasn't the potential set of customers you could sell into who are like, I really need these things. Before we jump deeper into the stack, I just want to talk about some of the benefits of operating as a default global company. I think the first and maybe major one seems kind of obvious, which is the global pool of talent, especially as engineering can be so expensive, especially in areas like the Bay Area. But I'm curious to hear what you see as some of the big benefits of operating globally for these companies.
So I think there are the cost benefits, but I think there are also a bunch of benefits in terms of your ability to build a sales force that can sell across multiple segments. Because there are so many different customer archetypes and they have so many needs that are going to be a little bit different, at least from region to region, I think it forces companies to actually, build out a more scalable sales approach than they might have built out had they started with just selling in Mountain View or just selling in the Bay Area. So it can drive a sort of maturation of how they manage customers and talent that wouldn't otherwise happen until much later.
And I think the one that's maybe less appreciated but huge is just the mindset, idea sharing, creativity you get from bringing consumer preferences, learning how things work in multiple different geographies. Like we've definitely noticed this on the investor side, but we'll invest in similar business models in the US, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Colombia, and they all work slightly different ways. And there's a lot of things that you can pull back and forth. Like for instance, a very obvious one, like Brazil has Pix, real-time payments are default, and that's great and fast. To make it real-time in the US requires like a much heavier lift, but you just get a better sense of like some of the benefits, some of the consumer experiences or business experiences particularly. And so having your foot in multiple geographies earlier on, I think often can help you build a better product.
Yeah, there are a lot of assumptions that you might not even realize you've made as assumptions about how financial services should or can operate, because most folks are, from the US, I'm from the US, and then you go somewhere else, you're like, wow, this is a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. And you can cross-pollinate ideas both from the US internationally and internationally back here. So we talked a little bit about the benefits of being, a default global company, the size of markets, the access to talent, the ideas you can access, but it's also not easy to build a default global company. We talked about the regulatory layers that are so hard. I want to talk about the opportunities, the areas that need to be solved for entrepreneurs to be able to more easily grow these default global companies. I think a great place to start, you guys have a great chart, listing key areas. But before we dive into all of those, maybe just talk through the first two investments you've done along these themes. First being in payroll and then also in expense management.
So we invested in a company called Jeeves, which is a global expense management platform. And what they do is they will locally issue cards. So if you're in Brazil, you got a Brazilian card. If you're in Mexico, you get a Mexico. Of course, it works globally. But even more interestingly is it becomes this financial operating system for companies. So your employees can expense in whatever currency they are. You can get one consolidated statement in whatever currency that you want. And then they hook into the local bill pay rails, right? So US is obvious, it's Pay in Mexico, it's Pix in Brazil. And you just like dramatically shorten any kind of that pain point. And their growth has been very explosive, demonstrating by the fact that like there really wasn't another solution there.
And Angela, I think that's an interesting point because Jeeves does global expense management, card issuing in 20 plus countries. But a lot of the capital markets powering that, those short duration loans before you pay off the balances on the card, to my understanding, that's all US capital markets for the most part that's actually backing that. So you needed to put together those two components to make it work. Is that still the case, or has that evolved maybe a little bit?
It's evolving. US capital markets for these type of businesses tends to be more evolved. But if you've proven out that you have good risk models, your consumers pay you back, it's just been much more of a just lack of anybody else being there, then you can tap into more local capital markets. And that turns out to be a great advantage.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's definitely is a huge problem. And it's also a huge opportunity. If you look at expense management in the US, there are a bunch of, very valuable companies. And you think about the problem globally, it's an even bigger opportunity and challenge.
Well, and it's interesting because it starts with like what everybody's looking for to start is like, hey, just give me a credit card because that's my need. But then really what they realize is like they don't have that multi-currency operating system and they can run their whole global finance teams on that. And that's where the product becomes just really sticky and useful.
Totally. And Anish, let's jump into Deel and payroll.
Yeah, payrolls is really, really exciting. So I think of Deel very much as powering borderless, which includes remote work, but isn't exclusive to remote work. The original insight was the compliance problem of hiring people internationally was enormous. And the way that it had been solved historically was having a very expensive set of consultants that would process payroll, that would hire your employees for you, manage them for you, fire them for you if necessary, and do so at a 6, 8, 10% cost, 10% of payroll, that is. So Deel's original insight, and they weren't first to market, but I think they had the most novel approach, which was lead with the software instead of the services and consultants. And they started with a tool that allowed folks to generate contracts for contractors that were compliant in almost any country, as you know well, Rex. And then they eventually moved into other parts of the hiring stack. And today, everyone from a contractor that's doing a 2-week stint to, a global office of hundreds of people domiciled somewhere else can be powered by Deel. They've done an excellent job of moving upmarket from the software core. And, the timing was excellent. The execution was excellent. Hopefully folks saw some of the numbers that were shared on Twitter. That's sort of the proof of everything I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of the core operating systems, whether it's Jeeves or Deel, yes, it is the money movement, but it's also the compliance engine. How do you manage regulations across so many geos that are constantly in flux? That's super hard.
And this is, I think this is important for payroll. It's also important for FX. A lot of times we talk about FX, at least I've historically thought of it as a money movement problem, but I think our view has evolved to one in which it's as much a KYB problem, or perhaps more so, than a transport layer problem.
Yeah, totally. And so, those are two areas, Deel and Jeeves, great problems, great solutions. The more you build global companies, the more you discover other areas that also need to be built out. So I want to talk through some of the other sectors that you're excited about. I know in your list, and we'll share this graphic, you have as areas incorporation, banking and treasury, the aforementioned expense management and payroll, but also just payments more broadly, people and talent, real estate and planning, financial planning and management. So talk to me, what are some of the core areas right now that you're seeing the most pain in and therefore potentially opportunity?
So one of the themes, and Anish brought it up, that cuts across all those areas is compliance. And until very recently, compliance was viewed as this, sort of frustrating, slow, I should probably grab somebody out of a bank to run it and I'll put them in a back office and just kind of hope that it works. And now I think there's just a strong realization that not only is it expensive and very manual, but if you do it well, it has an amazing impact to user experience and economics, right? And so bring up KYB that Anish did, just to figure out, is this business, who it is, and make sure they're not a money launderer, who are their beneficial owners? That's actually a difficult thing to do just in the US. If you're onboarding businesses all around the world, then the level of that problem goes exponentially. And so I think that's an area where often it's builders that had to deal with this in their first company. And they're spitting out all right, everybody has this pain point. How am I going to solve this for other companies going forward?
Totally. And Jeeves, I'm sure, has that specific pain point around KYB, onboarding companies globally, onboarding subsidiaries globally, and understanding what exactly that looks like. So
totally. Related, there's I think a big opportunity around everything cross-border. So I'll start with the investing opportunity, then I'll talk about the customer problem. FX, everyone knows that it's opaque. It's actually one of the most protected profit pools that banks and financial institutions have. Now, there's an open question of, is FX actually a product or is it a profit pool? And a lot of the model of how fintech companies have seen success is building a better software product and then monetizing it through an existing profit pool like FX. And I mean, maybe companies like Revolut have chipped away around the edges, but when you look at global money movement, FX being the largest, most liquid market in the world, there really hasn't been much that's changed in a long, long time.
Yeah. And technology often allows you to offer the same or better products at lower cost, which can change your business model. To your point, you can potentially commoditize your complement to some extent to offer FX at a lower rate, because really what you are is some kind of core operating system for money movement, as just one example. I also want to talk B2B versus B2C. First two investments you have done, Deel, Jeeves, B2B companies. Do you think that there's more of an opportunity set in the B2B sector for Default Global, or do you think there are other opportunities in the B2C?
Well, I think the most successful B2C example of jumping to another country is Nubank. And I remember, very early on when we were doing a bunch of very good consumer investing in the US. And one of the big thoughts is just, okay, how do you optimize your CAC? What are your channels? Just in fintech, there tends to be a lot of paid in the US. And then remember talking to the Nubank team, they're like, or you could build a great consumer product in a market where consumers are so dramatically underserved and our referral program just spreads, right? And so they've managed to take that from Brazil into Mexico. But it is a very challenging aspect.
Yeah.
I think what we're seeing with businesses, and this is the same in the US, but definitely worldwide, is they're more underserved by financial services. Yep. FX is an example, but all fintech is generally fairly opaque and fairly expensive. I think from a business model perspective, the thing we look at a lot is often businesses are looking for financial services. So for instance, they want credit, they want cheaper FX. But then the challenge from an investing point of view, if you start there, is customers are, oh, great, I'll take that loan because it's the cheapest. And the minute something cheaper comes along, you're like, oh, well, I'll switch out over there. And so it is smarter but harder to start with a software layer, become very sticky, and then layer on the financial services that add a lot of that monetization.
Yeah. And to dive into your Nubank example, I'm curious if you agree with this idea that maybe for B2C companies, they're more likely, the global ones, to start internationally and expand internationally like Nubank did than to start in the US. Because in the US, it's a large unified market. Other markets are smaller. So do you think that's a reasonable characterization, or do you think there's opportunity for the biggest B2C global companies to be, started in the US?
Yeah. I think it's hard to make a hard and fast rule. There's definitely great US companies who have expanded. But that is part of the reason. I do love investing in, very hungry founders from smaller markets. For instance, I have a great team out of Uruguay, population 3.7 million people, right? You're not going to build a massive business purely in Uruguay. And so it's interesting, right? You think of your business and everything as being multi-country right from the start, which is a significant advantage.
That's a great point. I think that's the magic of investing in Israeli founders as well. Just 10 million people. So there's no, funny enough, the founders from countries that have 100 million people, I think it's easy to talk yourself into believing that may be a big enough market. Whereas if you have 3 or 10, you just know that it isn't. I actually have 2 that I think are worth mentioning. So one, I'll cheat and bring up Deel again. And then I want to talk about Revolut quickly. So Deel, they're well known for enabling borderless hiring. They're less well known for actually offering financial services to the people that are being paid via Deel, which is actually a really straightforward insight. It's the one I brought up earlier, and that is for a lot of folks, if you're working in Ukraine or Pakistan, you really want a US dollar denominated bank account. You really want access to, earned wage. There's a whole bunch of things that we take for granted here that you may not actually have access to, that Deel provides you with. And the nice thing is that 1, they have a channel, but 2, it selects for, mostly white collar workers that you can lend to and offer a richer set of financial services to. So I think that's actually the most interesting example that I know of. Revolut is cool too. Revolut has gone cross-border within the EU. They haven't done stuff that's really worked outside of the EU, but I would argue that Europe it's a sort of, it's almost an academic construct, because each of those countries has their own consumer preferences, many of their own regulations and laws. And for, companies like Monzo, they've had difficulty expanding outside of the UK because of those reasons. Whereas Revolut started with a cross-border value prop, which is no fee FX at ATMs all over the EU, which has set them up nicely to actually dominate more of the region than just their home country.
Yeah, the stability of the US dollar is a huge feature that a lot of people want access to. The craziest story I heard about this is in Venezuela, something like 20% of digital retail transactions are done using Zelle. So it's a US KYC relative, and they're using their Zelle thing to do a Zelle which just shows you like there's so much demand for that stability that you would go through this convoluted process to transact through your relatives' accounts in a foreign country, so you don't have to deal with a hyperinflation local currency. So yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff about connecting the U.S. system globally for consumers. And then last point I just want to touch on too before we wrap things up is just thinking about some of the second order impacts of what being default global means. You know, how that can impact geographies like coastal Portugal or rural Montana, as you spoke to in your piece, but also other impacts as well.
Yeah, I think, and this is, to be honest, one of the most exciting things and just has the potential to really elevate so many different countries, right? Like you think of what does it take to start a company? And there are smart people worldwide. But then you would have to hire, your 10 smartest friends and preferably, as you scaled, people who had experience taking your company from 1 million to 10 million to 100 people. And just prior to this shift, most of those people tended to be in areas where large companies had been built before. And so where this default global takes is like, I can start a company in pick your country and, still hire your very smart friends. But when you start to need more experienced execs that might not exist close around you, you can hire those people in different geos. I'll take some examples. Like some of my companies in LATAM have been looking for, head of risk. And now they can get the best person out of Capital One that would be very willing to come down to Brazil a week a month, but didn't want to move. And it can just accelerate the growth of those companies. And then I think what happens, the third order effect is now pick your country that didn't have any unicorns or huge startups. Those companies grow, those executives start to leave their experience, they start to start new companies, and it just really accelerates entrepreneurship around the world.
I think the other interesting thing, Rex, is that with fintech as a business model for internet companies, you can, perhaps to contradict our point earlier a little bit, you can actually build pretty big businesses for a relatively small number of people. If you look at the gross profit per, like the ARPU for a single person in most internet companies, it's just not enough to justify a specialized solution for a country like Canada.
Yeah, so basically, you could potentially have businesses of ARPUs of $5 to $10, which, by the way, Credit Karma started below 5 or 10, I think, originally, and then scaled quite a bit from there. That opens up completely new idea spaces. No, I think that's super interesting. On the global point too, just personal networks have changed so much. I'm sure this is true for you. Maybe it was already more true for you, being Canadians having come to the US, but I think pre-pandemic, how many people that I know in global cities, and it's a very short list, and now I know people in Buenos Aires and CDMX in London and Lisbon and Paris, like all around the world that I communicate with regularly, and that was not the case 24 months ago. And so I think a lot about networks, and I think networks matter in terms of ideas, et cetera. And so I think that's going to be one of the big exciting things, just to see what this new globalized community of people starts working on.
The magic of the time we're in now, when we were in the pre-COVID world, networks and geographies were the very same thing. Silicon Valley was the place. And during COVID, everything was over the internet, which was fine, but didn't allow for any serendipity. There just isn't really serendipity. I mean, maybe in the dark corners of the internet, but not in your day-to-day professional life. And now we're in this place where, Rex, to your point, a lot of folks that we know are global, but we can actually go visit them and interact with them and sort of rediscover that serendipity. So I think this is actually the very best time to be building something in default global and in tech generally.
I think that's a great note to end on. It's time to build globally. So thanks so much, Angela and Anish, for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Awesome. What a great conversation we had with Anish and Angela. You can see why I enjoyed working with them so much. Like I said, sharp thinkers, great humans. So if you enjoyed this content, please hit the like button or smash subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.